In a world where money can buy almost anything, what happens when the heir to a fortune discovers that his wealth can't save him from the hardest battle of all, finding his true purpose? This is the story of Nathaniel Turner, a privileged young man whose life takes an unexpected turn after a life-threatening accident forces him to question everything he thought he knew about success, family, and happiness. If Nathaniel's journey resonates with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of transformation and self-discovery. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for the next chapter in his life-changing journey. The sound of the heart monitor's constant beep was the only noise in the sterile hospital room. The cold fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an almost eerie glow over the figure lying motionless in the bed. Nathaniel Turner, heir to one of the wealthiest families in the United States, lay unconscious, his once perfect features now bruised and battered. It wasn't supposed to happen to someone like him. The accident, the result of a reckless night out in his sports car, had left Nathaniel's life hanging in the balance. One moment, he was living in a world of luxury, surrounded by opulence, designer clothes, and parties that lasted until dawn. The next, he was here, a victim of his own excess, a victim of someone who thought they could outrun fate. And in that moment, Nathaniel's life was in the hands of someone who came from a world he never even bothered to notice. Her name was Maria Cruz, a Filipino nurse with a quiet strength that matched her resilience. She didn't come from wealth or privilege. In fact, she came from a small village in the Philippines, a place where survival wasn't a guarantee. But she was determined to build a life for herself, one patient at a time. Maria's eyes met Nathaniel's, lying there in a coma, unconscious to the world around him. She was just another nurse to him, someone who would do her job and leave. But Maria didn't see him as just another patient. She saw a young man who, despite all his wealth, was as fragile as anyone else. His expensive clothes, his family's name, and his trust fund didn't matter now. In this moment, she had the power to save him, or to lose him forever. Maria had seen it all. The rich, the famous, the entitled, people who thought money could buy them anything. But she knew better. She had been through her own struggles, worked herself to exhaustion just to be where she was. And yet, no one ever noticed her, just like Nathaniel. Only her struggle had been quiet, and hers had been the type that had built her strength. But saving Nathaniel's life would take more than medical skill. It would take something that money couldn't buy: compassion, care, and the quiet determination that came from someone who had fought every day just to have a chance at something better. As Maria adjusted the IV drip, she took a moment to think about the journey that had led her here. A journey that would soon intersect with Nathaniel's in a way neither of them could have ever anticipated. Before you find out how their worlds collide, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning of an unexpected story of redemption, humility, and the power of human connection. You won't want to miss what happens next. Maria's fingers trembled as she adjusted the oxygen mask over Nathaniel's face. She had been working in this hospital for years, but today, something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the gravity of the accident, or maybe it was the reality that she was now responsible for this man's life. A man who by all accounts had everything, and yet here he was, broken and vulnerable in a way that no amount of wealth could fix. As she checked his vitals again, she thought about her own journey. How she had come to this country with nothing but a suitcase full of hope and a dream of a better life. She had learned early on that in this world, it wasn't enough to have money or status. It was about grit, determination, and a willingness to face adversity head on. And as she looked at Nathaniel now, she couldn't help but wonder if he had ever experienced any real struggle, or if his life had always been so sheltered by the comfort of his family's wealth. Maria's thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Jacobs, the attending physician, walked into the room. He gave Nathaniel a cursory glance before turning to Maria. "How's he doing?" Dr. Jacobs asked, his voice cold and clinical. "He's stable for now," Maria replied. "But we need to keep monitoring him closely. The next few hours will be critical." Dr. Jacobs nodded, as if he already knew that. "We'll need to run more tests once he wakes up. Keep an eye on his blood pressure, and make sure he gets the right nutrients through the IV. Let me know if anything changes." Maria nodded, but as the doctor left, her mind lingered on Nathaniel. She had seen so many rich patients come through these doors, thinking they could buy their way out of anything, only to learn the hard way that money couldn't solve every problem. Nathaniel was no different. The crash, his injuries. These weren't things that could be fixed by a designer label or a trust fund. But as the day wore on, something began to shift in Maria. She couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward Nathaniel, even if he didn't deserve it. The wealthy often saw people like her as invisible, just another worker in the background. But in this moment, she held his life in her hands, and that gave her a sense of power that no amount of money could buy. As she sat down to review his chart, Maria heard a faint sound. Nathaniel's fingers twitched, and his eyes fluttered open, just for a second. He was still disoriented, confused by the reality of his situation. Maria quickly stood up and rushed to his side, her voice soft but firm. "Nathaniel, can you hear me?" His eyes met hers, filled with a mix of confusion and fear. For a moment, she saw vulnerability in his gaze, a side of him that no one in his world would ever expect. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he just looked at her, as if trying to process what was happening. Maria took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning. She couldn't help him with money or connections, but she could help him in the ways that mattered, by being there, by doing her job, and by showing him that there was more to life than wealth and status. "I'm here to help you, Nathaniel," Maria said, her voice gentle. "Just take it one step at a time. You're going to be okay." Nathaniel blinked, and for the first time since he'd come to the hospital, he seemed to focus on her. She wasn't just a nurse to him anymore. She was the one person who had the power to change his fate. As Maria turned to adjust his IV drip once more, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope stirring within her. Nathaniel Turner, the young man who had once seemed so untouchable, might just be about to learn a lesson that no amount of money could ever teach. But the road ahead would not be easy for either of them. The days that followed were a blur of constant checkups, tests, and treatments. Nathaniel was no longer unconscious, but he was far from the vibrant, confident young man he had once been. Every small movement seemed to take a toll on him. His body was bruised, and the once perfect features were now marred with cuts and swelling. But it was the emotional toll that was the hardest to witness. Maria couldn't shake the image of Nathaniel's eyes, the uncertainty, the fear, the realization that nothing about his life had prepared him for this moment. She watched as his eyes wandered around the sterile hospital room, as if searching for something that could make sense of the chaos he was now living. At first, he had been too proud to admit how weak he truly was. He didn't want anyone to see him vulnerable, not even Maria. He refused to talk about his accident or ask for help. But Maria, who had seen this kind of behavior before, knew that the healing process went beyond physical injuries. She knew that Nathaniel would have to confront something far deeper, his sense of entitlement, his view of the world, and perhaps the realization that his wealth couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. One afternoon, as Maria adjusted his IV and checked his vitals, Nathaniel spoke for the first time since regaining consciousness. "Why are you helping me?" His voice was raspy, barely audible, but the question was clear. Maria looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She had expected him to ask about his family, about how long he would be in the hospital, or even about the latest headlines surrounding his accident. But instead, he was asking something far more personal. "Because it's my job," Maria said, keeping her voice calm, though she knew it was more than that. "I'm here to help you get better." Nathaniel's gaze softened for a moment. He seemed to be processing her words, but then a hint of skepticism appeared in his eyes. "But I'm rich. I can pay for the best treatment. Why are you, someone like you, even bothering with me?" The question stung, but Maria refused to let it show. She understood where his thoughts came from. His world was one where money solved everything, where people like him were used to being in control, used to getting what they wanted. Maria paused before responding, her voice steady. "Money can't buy everything, Nathaniel. It can't buy your health. It can't buy your happiness. And most importantly, it can't buy people's hearts. That's something you'll have to earn, not purchase." Nathaniel fell silent at her words, his eyes drifting away as he contemplated what she had said. It was the first time he had been forced to confront something more significant than the wealth that had always defined him. For the first time, he was seeing Maria not as just another nurse, but as someone who had something he didn't, something that his money couldn't buy, a sense of purpose, a sense of integrity, and a strength that came from within. The next few days were quiet. Maria continued to tend to Nathaniel, checking on him regularly, administering medication, and encouraging him to eat. There were moments when he looked at her with an almost childlike curiosity, as if he were beginning to understand that the world didn't revolve around his family's fortune. Slowly, Maria noticed small changes. His walls were beginning to crumble. He would ask more questions about her life, her past, the sacrifices she had made to be here, and each time Maria gave him a glimpse into her journey. She told him about the struggles of being an immigrant, how she worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and how she had learned to fight for her dreams even when the world seemed determined to stop her. By the end of the week, Nathaniel was making steady progress, but it wasn't just his physical health that was improving. It was his outlook on life. For the first time, he was truly listening, not to the advice of his family or his friends, but to someone who had fought harder for less, someone who had been where he was, but had risen above it all. It was a quiet evening when Nathaniel finally spoke again. This time, his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable. "Maria, what's it like to not have money, to have to work for everything?" Maria smiled gently, surprised by the question. It wasn't a typical thing for someone like Nathaniel to ask. But she could see the change in him. the realization that his old way of thinking, his old way of living, had been flawed all along. "It's hard," Maria said honestly, "but it's also rewarding. When you have to work for everything you get, you learn to appreciate it more. You learn to appreciate the people who help you along the way, the people who don't expect anything in return. You realize that life isn't about what you have, but what you give." Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze now full of something he hadn't shown her before: respect. "You're a good person, Maria," he said quietly. I don't think I realized how lucky I've been, how lucky I still am." Maria didn't reply, but she didn't need to. In that moment, the shift had occurred. Nathaniel Turner had learned a valuable lesson, not just about life, but about the kind of person he wanted to become. But would it be enough? Would the lessons he had learned in this hospital room stick when he was finally well enough to leave? Days turned into weeks, and Nathaniel's recovery progressed faster than anyone had expected. His physical injuries were healing, and his strength was slowly returning. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. Nathaniel was beginning to confront his own demons: the entitlement, the arrogance, the belief that his wealth could shield him from the harsh realities of life. Maria was his constant companion through it all. She was there when he struggled with his physical therapy, when he fought to regain his strength, and when his frustration reached a breaking point. But what struck her the most was the shift in his attitude. He was no longer the brash, privileged young man who had entered the hospital. He was quieter now, more reflective. And though he never openly admitted it, Maria could sense that Nathaniel was beginning to understand what it meant to be truly humble. One afternoon, Maria found him sitting by the window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. It was a peaceful scene, but there was an unmistakable weight in the air, one that seemed to come from within Nathaniel himself. Maria approached him slowly, her soft footsteps breaking the silence. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, letting him gather his thoughts. Nathaniel turned toward her, his expression contemplative. "I used to think everything could be bought," he said quietly. "That if I wanted something, I could just pay for it, whether it was a new car or the best doctor, or even someone's loyalty. But now, I'm not so sure anymore." Maria nodded, her heart warming at his words. She had always known that wealth couldn't buy happiness, but hearing him say it aloud was a breakthrough. Nathaniel Turner, who had once thought himself above others, was finally beginning to see the truth. "You're starting to see the bigger picture," Maria said gently. "Money can't buy integrity. It can't buy trust. And it definitely can't buy the things that really matter." Nathaniel stared out the window for a while, lost in thought. "I've hurt a lot of people, haven't I?" he asked, his voice tinged with guilt. "I've treated people like they were disposable, like they were just there to serve me. Even my family, my friends, they've been nothing but yes men, always agreeing with whatever I said, doing whatever I wanted. But I've never really thought about what they need, what they feel." Maria didn't respond immediately, knowing that this was a realization Nathaniel had to come to on his own. But she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for him. This wasn't the same man who had come into the hospital weeks ago. This was someone who was learning to grow, to evolve, to see the world through the eyes of others. "You're starting to understand," Maria said softly, "and that's all anyone can ask for. You can't change the past, but you can change how you move forward." Nathaniel turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers with newfound sincerity. Thank you, Maria. You've taught me more than I could have ever learned from anyone else. I don't think I would have ever realized any of this if it weren't for you. Maria smiled, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. She wasn't looking for thanks. She was doing her job. But hearing those words from Nathaniel, knowing that she had helped him in some way, was a reward in itself. The next few days were a blur of conversations, physical therapy, and small victories. Nathaniel had begun reaching out to his family, apologizing for his past behavior, and seeking to make amends. He even started working on a charity initiative, one that focused on helping underprivileged communities, something he had never thought about before. Maria watched all of this from the sidelines, proud but detached. This was his journey now, not hers. And yet, she couldn't help but feel like a part of her had been woven into it. Maybe, just maybe, she had made a difference in a way she never expected. It was on one of these days, as Nathaniel sat up in his hospital bed, that he looked at Maria with a more determined expression than she had ever seen on him before. "I want to do more," he said, his voice steady. "I want to make things right, not just with my family, but with the world. I want to show people that I'm not just another rich kid who thinks money can fix everything." Maria's heart swelled with pride. She had no idea where Nathaniel's journey would take him, but she knew one thing for sure. He was on a path to something greater. "You already are," she said softly. "The fact that you're willing to change, to admit your mistakes, that shows more strength than anything else." Nathaniel smiled, the kind of genuine smile that Maria hadn't seen from him in weeks. For the first time, he wasn't just Nathaniel Turner, the heir to the Turner fortune. He was Nathaniel Turner, a man who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that redemption doesn't come from money. It comes from within. And as he looked out the window again, this time with a sense of peace in his heart, Maria knew that his journey was just beginning. Nathaniel's transformation was slow, but undeniable. Weeks passed, and every small step forward seemed to carry more weight than the last. He was no longer the cocky, self-absorbed young man he had once been. Instead, Nathaniel was learning humility, patience, and the importance of relationships, things he had never truly valued before. But change is never easy, especially when the world around you isn't ready to let go of who you used to be. One afternoon, Maria overheard a conversation between Nathaniel and his father, Gregory Turner, one of the wealthiest men in the country. Nathaniel had called his father, asking him to come visit. At first, Maria wasn't sure if she should listen in. It wasn't her place. But something about the tension in Nathaniel's voice stopped her in her tracks. She leaned closer to the door, hoping she wouldn't disturb their conversation. "I don't understand, Nathaniel." Gregory's voice was stern, the kind of tone that suggested no room for compromise. "Why are you wasting your time with all these projects? You've got a company to run. You've got an image to maintain. What's this nonsense about charity and helping the underprivileged?" Nathaniel's voice, which had once been full of bravado, now held a quiet frustration. "Dad, this isn't just a phase. I'm trying to do something that actually matters. People need help, and I want to be a part of that." Maria could hear the frustration in his words, the clashing of two worlds, the one he had always known, full of privilege and status, and the one he was now trying to navigate, filled with humility and purpose. "You're a fool if you think this will fix everything, Nathaniel," Gregory snapped. "This is a business. You can't just walk away from the life we've built for you. Your mother and I sacrificed too much for you to throw it all away on some charity." Nathaniel's voice was quieter now, but Maria could hear the resolve in his words. "I'm not throwing anything away, Dad. I'm just trying to be something more than the sum of my inheritance." There was a long pause. Maria could almost feel the weight of the moment, the tension between father and son, between old expectations and new desires. She knew Nathaniel wasn't just battling his own desires. He was fighting for his place in a world that had always viewed him as nothing more than a name on a piece of paper. After a moment of silence, Gregory spoke again, this time with a softer tone. "I don't like this, Nathaniel. But I can't stop you, can I?" "No." Nathaniel's voice was firm, yet soft, as if he had made his decision long ago. "You can't. This is who I am now." Maria took a step back from the door, unsure of what to feel. Nathaniel had stood his ground, but at what cost? His father was the pillar of the family's fortune, a man who had always controlled the narrative, the decisions, and the future of the Turner legacy. Nathaniel's decision to shift focus from corporate growth to something more altruistic was bound to cause a rift. As Maria returned to Nathaniel's room, she found him sitting by the window again, just as he had done in the early days of his recovery. This time, there was no golden sunset. The sky was gray, heavy with rain that mirrored the storm inside him. "Nathaniel?" Maria asked gently, her voice soft but full of concern. He turned to her, a look of quiet determination on his face. "I had the conversation with my dad," he said, his voice betraying a mix of exhaustion and relief. "He doesn't get it, but I'm not changing my mind." Maria nodded, understanding more than he realized. She had seen this before, the clash between family expectations and personal growth. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. "I'm proud of you, Nathaniel," Maria said quietly, her words genuine. "It's never easy to walk away from what everyone expects you to be." Nathaniel smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes that Maria couldn't ignore. "I don't know what's next, but I'm not going back to who I was." He stood up slowly, his body still recovering, but his spirit stronger than it had ever been. "I'm not just Nathaniel Turner anymore. I'm someone who wants to make a difference. I want to create something real, not just profit off what my family built." Maria couldn't help but admire his resolve. She knew it wasn't just about charity or making amends. It was about Nathaniel finding his own purpose, one that had nothing to do with his family's wealth or status. It was about him becoming the man he wanted to be, not the man everyone else expected him to be. "I think you're on the right path," Maria said, her voice warm with encouragement. "But remember, change isn't just about the big moments. It's about the small steps, the ones no one sees." Nathaniel looked at her, a sense of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, Maria. You've been more of a guide to me than anyone else." Maria smiled, though there was a bitter sweetness in her expression. She had known from the start that Nathaniel's journey was his own, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far he had come. But as the days passed, Maria also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Nathaniel's real test would come when he faced the world outside of the hospital, the world that still saw him as the privileged son of the Turner Empire. Would his transformation be enough to survive the expectations of his family? Would he be able to walk away from the life he had known for so long? Only time would tell. Nathaniel was discharged from the hospital a few days later. He had come a long way physically, but emotionally, The road ahead still seemed uncertain. His body was healing, but the emotional scars, the guilt, the regret, and the constant pressure from his family were not as easy to mend. Maria had seen it before. People who experienced near-death moments often emerged with a new outlook on life. But as soon as they returned to their old environment, they were quickly pulled back into the same cycle of expectations, pressures, and old habits. Nathaniel had made progress, but he was about to face the hardest part of his journey, the world beyond the hospital walls. Nathaniel's father had made it clear during their conversation that he didn't approve of Nathaniel's newfound values. The Turner family was built on legacy, and Gregory Turner didn't take kindly to change, especially when it threatened his carefully crafted empire. His influence over Nathaniel was undeniable, and now that Nathaniel was free to go home, he was going to have to navigate this rocky relationship once again. Nathaniel stood in his family's grand estate, staring out over the sprawling lawn, the place he had always called home. The mansion was a symbol of everything he had once thought he wanted: wealth, power, and status. But now it felt more like a cage. The walls seemed to close in on him as he realized that this was the world he had once belonged to, and yet it was no longer a world he could fit into. His mother, Eleanor Turner, was the first to greet him when he walked through the door. She gave him a tight hug, but her eyes showed concern. She could see the difference in him. The Nathaniel who had once commanded attention with his charm and wit was now more subdued, more introspective. He had lost the bravado that once defined him. "Are you sure you're ready to come home, Nathaniel?" Eleanor asked gently. "You've been through so much." Nathaniel nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Just a little different, that's all." Eleanor didn't press him further, but Nathaniel could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand the changes he was going through. No one in his family did. His transformation was foreign to them. A son who had always been a reflection of his father's ideals, now suddenly walking a different path. Gregory Turner, on the other hand, wasn't as subtle. He had been waiting for Nathaniel in the library, the same room where they had shared many tense conversations in the past. His sharp gaze met Nathaniel's as he entered, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "You're home," Gregory said, his voice cold. "I hope you've had enough time to think about your decisions." Nathaniel took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would be nothing like the ones he'd had with Maria. This wasn't about compassion or understanding. This was about expectations, legacy, and control. "I've thought about it," Nathaniel replied, "and I stand by what I said. I'm not going to run the company the way you want me to. I'm not going to follow in your footsteps if it means ignoring the things that really matter." Gregory's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're being naive, Nathaniel. This isn't a game. You don't just throw away everything your family has worked for. You have responsibilities. Do you understand that?" "I understand perfectly," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to spend my life chasing things that don't make me happy. I want to help people. I want to do something real. And I can't do that if I'm stuck in a business I don't believe in." Gregory was silent for a moment, his disappointment palpable. He had expected resistance, but hearing it from Nathaniel in such firm terms was something he hadn't anticipated. "You're making a mistake," Gregory said, his voice low and filled with frustration. You think you can change the world, but you can't even change your own life. You think this charity nonsense is going to make you feel better? You think it's going to fill the hole inside you?" Nathaniel's chest tightened at his father's words, but he didn't back down. He had heard it all before: the promises of power, the unrelenting expectations, the idea that success meant wealth. But none of it mattered anymore. "I'm not doing this to fill a hole, Dad," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and I'm not going to apologize for that." Gregory's face hardened, his jaw set in anger. "Fine. Do what you want. But don't come crawling back when you realize the world isn't as kind as you think it is." Nathaniel stood tall, feeling the weight of his father's words, but also feeling a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer defined by his family's expectations. He was ready to create his own path, even if it meant walking away from everything he had known. As he left the library, Maria's words echoed in his mind. Change isn't just about the big moments, it's about the small steps, the ones no one sees. This was one of those small steps, the hardest one. But it was his step to take. Nathaniel spent the next few weeks outside the confines of his family's mansion, living in a small, modest apartment that he had rented in a quiet part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was his. The luxury that once defined him was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of peace that he hadn't realized he was missing. The apartment was small, the furniture basic, but there was a quiet comfort in knowing that everything in this space was the result of his own choices. No one had bought it for him. No one had handed it to him on a silver platter. He had chosen it. Every day, he spent hours working on his new project, a charity that focused on providing education and healthcare to underprivileged communities, particularly immigrant populations. It wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It wasn't about proving a point to his family or anyone else. It was about making a real impact, something that would last long after he was gone. Maria continued to visit him, offering both professional guidance and personal support. She had seen his transformation firsthand, and while he was far from perfect, she could see the sincerity in his efforts. She knew that this wasn't a temporary phase. Nathaniel had truly changed. One evening, as they sat together in the small kitchen of his apartment, discussing future plans for the charity, Nathaniel spoke up. "You were right, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's not about the big moments. It's the small steps. It's about showing up every day, no matter how hard it gets." Maria smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I'm proud of you, Nathaniel. But remember, it's not just about the work you do. It's about the person you've become." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the quiet determination that had replaced the arrogance he once had. He had come so far since that fateful day in the hospital when he had realized that nothing in his life could protect him from the consequences of his own choices. Now, he was on the path to redemption, not just for himself, but for others. As the weeks passed, Nathaniel continued to face challenges, but they were different from the ones he had once feared. His family's disapproval was constant, but he no longer felt the need to seek their approval. He was learning to live for himself, not for the image that others had created for him. There were times when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he had made the right decision, but each time he reminded himself that this was his journey to walk, no one else's. One afternoon, as he was wrapping up a meeting with some local community leaders, about a new project. He received a call from his mother. Eleanor had been quiet lately, not fully understanding Nathaniel's decision, but she had always been a loving and caring mother. "Mom?" Nathaniel answered, unsure of what to expect. "Are you okay, Nathaniel?" Eleanor's voice was softer than usual, the concern evident. "I know you're doing this charity work, but I just wanted to check in on you. Are you happy? Is this really what you want?" Nathaniel took a deep breath, the weight of her question settling in his chest. Was he happy? Was this what he wanted? For the first time, he realized that he didn't need to answer to anyone else. He had already made his choice, and though it was still a long road ahead, he was finally living the life he had always wanted. "I'm happy, Mom," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "This is what I've always wanted. I'm not doing this for anyone else. I'm doing it for me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Nathaniel thought she might say something to dissuade him. But instead, his mother's voice softened. "Then I'm proud of you, Nathaniel," she said quietly. "I don't fully understand it, but I'm proud of you for following your heart. Just remember, you don't have to do this alone." Tears welled up in Nathaniel's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He hadn't expected his mother's approval, but hearing it from her meant more than he could ever explain. "I know, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you." As the conversation ended, Nathaniel felt a sense of calm wash over him. His family still didn't fully understand his choices, but they were beginning to accept him for who he was becoming, not who they had always wanted him to be. That night, as he sat at his small kitchen table, looking over the plans for his charity's next steps, Maria walked in with a smile. "You look like you've had a good day," she said. Nathaniel smiled back, a sense of peace settling over him. "I have. It's been a good day. I'm finally starting to believe that I can do this. I can make a difference." Maria sat down beside him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You already have. You just didn't know it yet." Nathaniel looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. He had come so far since that fateful day in the hospital, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He was on the right path. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Turner was truly living for himself. And that was enough. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, looking out the window of his apartment. The city stretched out before him, buzzing with life, its lights twinkling like 1,000 stars. A far cry from the quiet, isolated life he had once imagined for himself. As the days turned into weeks and then months, Nathaniel's journey continued. The charity he had founded grew stronger, reaching more communities, providing better opportunities for education and healthcare, and truly making an impact on the lives of those who needed it the most. And through it all, he remained grounded in the lessons he had learned about humility, gratitude, and the true meaning of success. Maria remained by his side, not just as a nurse, but as a friend and confidant. She had been there from the beginning, guiding him through the darkest moments of his life, helping him navigate the complex world of change. Together, they worked side by side, driven by a shared goal, to create something that would outlast them both. Nathaniel's relationship with his family remained strained, but with time, he noticed small shifts. His mother visited more often, offering quiet support, and even Gregory Turner, the man who had once disowned him for choosing a different path, began to soften. While they never fully understood Nathaniel's choices, they began to respect the man he was becoming. He still had the wealth, the connections, and the legacy of the Turner name. But for the first time, they didn't define him. Nathaniel had forged his own identity, one that was built on the values he had learned through his struggles, his mistakes, and his willingness to change. In the end, it wasn't the amount of money in his bank account or the size of his father's empire that mattered. What truly mattered was the difference he had made, the lives he had touched, and the man he had become. A man who had found the courage to walk away from everything he thought he wanted to pursue the life that would truly fulfill him. As he sat in his apartment that night, staring out at the city that had once felt so foreign to him, Nathaniel smiled to himself. The journey had been long, and it had been hard, but it had been worth it. And in that moment, he knew that this was just the beginning.